In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns reached toward the heavens and the echoes of 1,000 prayers filled sacred halls, there existed a darkness so profound that even today, scholars hesitate to speak of it in full detail. Among the most revered figures of Roman society were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses chosen by the gods themselves to guard the eternal flame that symbolized Rome's divine protection. Yet when these sacred women fell from grace, they faced a punishment so horrific, so deliberately cruel, that it stands as one of humanity's most chilling examples of institutionalized terror. The story we are about to tell is not merely one of religious fanaticism or ancient barbarism. It is a tale of how power, politics, and sacred duty intertwined to create a system where innocence could be crushed beneath the weight of suspicion, where the most holy could become the most damned. This is the story of live burial, of women sealed alive in underground tombs, left to die in darkness while a city watched in silence. Today, we delve into the shadows of Roman history to uncover the truth behind these executions, punishments that were justified as divine necessity but often served as tools of political manipulation. We will explore how young girls, chosen for their purity, could find themselves facing the most impure of deaths. We will examine the cases of those who may have been innocent, victims of false accusations and political intrigue. This examination is not for the faint of heart. The practices we will discuss represent humanity at its most cruel, yet they are essential to understanding the complex machinery of Roman power and the terrible price paid by those who served its gods. These are the stories that history books often omit, the dark truths hidden beneath the glory of empire. The institution of the Vestal Virgins was as old as Rome itself, tracing its origins back to the legendary King Numa Pompilius in the 8th century BCE. These priestesses were not merely religious figures, they were living symbols of Rome's covenant with the divine, guardians of the sacred fire that represented the eternal life of the city. The selection process itself was a solemn affair that forever altered the lives of young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10. When the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, identified potential candidates, he would perform the ancient ritual of captio, literally taking the girl from her family. The chosen child would be led to the Temple of Vesta, where she would begin a 30-year commitment that divided her life into 3 distinct phases: 10 years of learning, 10 years of service, and 10 years of teaching others. During this entire period, she was bound by the most sacred of vows: absolute chastity. The daily life of a Vestal Virgin was one of privilege, shadowed by constant vigilance. These women enjoyed rights unprecedented in Roman society. They could own property, make wills, and even free slaves. They held the power to pardon condemned criminals simply by touching them on their way to execution. When they walked through Rome's streets, even consuls would make way for them. They were invited to the finest banquets, given the best seats at gladiatorial games, and treated with reverence that bordered on worship. Yet beneath these privileges lay a foundation of terror. Every aspect of their lives was scrutinized, every friendship questioned, every glance examined for signs of impropriety. The Romans believed that the purity of the Vestals was directly linked to the security of the state. If the sacred fire went out through negligence, it was seen as an omen of disaster. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, it was believed that Rome itself would fall. The psychological pressure on these women was immense. From childhood, they were taught that their personal desires were secondary to their sacred duty. They lived in a world where the slightest misstep could lead to accusation, where the natural human desire for companionship and love was transformed into a potential death sentence. They were simultaneously the most honored and most endangered women in Roman society. The Temple of Vesta itself became both sanctuary and prison. Located in the Roman Forum, it was a circular building that housed the eternal flame, sacred objects, including the Palladium of Troy and the living quarters of the priestesses. The temple's round shape, unique among Roman religious buildings, was said to represent the hearth of the city. Within its walls, the Vestals maintained not just a fire, but the very essence of Roman identity. The social dynamics within the Vestal house were complex and often fraught with tension. The Virgo Vestalis Maxima, the chief priestess, held authority over the others, but this hierarchy could become a source of conflict. Older priestesses sometimes viewed their younger colleagues with suspicion, knowing that accusations of unchastity could arise from personal feuds or professional jealousies. As Rome evolved from republic to empire, the role of the Vestal virgins became even more politically significant. Emperors understood the symbolic power these women held and often used their support to legitimize their rule. The Vestals became pawns in larger political games, their sacred status making them valuable allies or dangerous enemies depending on the circumstances. The vow of chastity taken by the Vestal virgins was not merely a personal commitment. It was a sacred contract with the divine that bound not just the individual priestess, but the entire Roman state. This oath, sworn in the presence of the Pontifex Maximus and witnessed by the other Vestals, was considered unbreakable. The words themselves were ancient, passed down through generations, and carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Roman religious law, the ius sacrum, treated violations of this vow as among the most serious crimes possible. The Romans believed that the gods communicated their displeasure through various signs and omens, and the breaking of a Vestal's chastity was thought to bring divine wrath upon the entire city. Military defeats, natural disasters, plagues, and famines were all potential consequences of a Vestal's transgression. The concept of incestus, the technical term for a Vestal's violation of chastity, carried implications far beyond sexual impropriety. In Roman thinking, it represented a fundamental disruption of the cosmic order, a breach in the contract between Rome and its protecting deities. The word itself derived from in, not, and castus, pure, emphasizing that the crime was one of pollution rather than merely personal misconduct. The investigation process for suspected violations was elaborate and terrifying. When accusations arose, the Pontifex Maximus would convene a special tribunal of pontifices, the college of priests responsible for maintaining Roman religious law. These investigations were conducted in secret, with the accused Vestal having limited rights to defend herself. The burden of proof was deliberately low, as the Romans believed that the gods would reveal truth through divine signs and omens. During the investigation, the suspected Vestal would be suspended from her duties and placed under house arrest. She would be forbidden from tending the sacred fire or participating in religious ceremonies, effectively making her a pariah within her own community. This isolation was itself a form of punishment, as these women had spent their entire adult lives defined by their sacred role. The evidence considered in these cases was often circumstantial and subjective. A Vestal might be accused based on nothing more than being seen speaking privately with a man, receiving gifts, or displaying what was considered excessive interest in worldly affairs. Love letters, if discovered, were considered damning evidence, as were any gifts from male admirers. Even changes in appearance, wearing makeup, elaborate hairstyles, or expensive jewelry, could be interpreted as signs of sexual impropriety. The psychological torture of the investigation process was perhaps as cruel as the eventual punishment. The accused woman would be questioned repeatedly about her relationships, her thoughts, her dreams, and her desires. Every friendship would be scrutinized, every moment of her life examined for signs of guilt. The other Vestals would be questioned about their colleagues' behavior, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal within the sacred house. The political implications of these investigations were enormous. Accusations against Vestals often coincided with periods of political instability or military crisis. Leaders would use such charges to deflect blame for disasters, claiming that divine displeasure was responsible for Rome's troubles rather than poor governance or military strategy. The Vestals became scapegoats for the failures of the state. When a Vestal virgin was found guilty of breaking her sacred vow, Roman law presented a terrible contradiction. The principle that no blood of a Vestal could be shed by human hands meant that traditional forms of execution, beheading, crucifixion, or gladiatorial combat were forbidden. Instead, the Romans devised a punishment that was perhaps more cruel than any of these: live burial, a method that would allow the gods themselves to determine the priestess's fate. The execution site was located near the Porta Collina, outside the city walls, in an area known as the Campus Celeratus, the Field of the Accursed. Here, a small underground chamber had been constructed specifically for this purpose. The chamber was barely large enough for a single person to stand or lie down, with dimensions that ensured the condemned would experience maximum psychological torment in their final hours. The descent into this underground tomb began with a procession through Rome that was both funeral and spectacle. The condemned Vestal, dressed in her sacred robes for the last time, would be placed in a closed litter, a covered sedan chair that prevented the crowd from seeing her face. This detail was crucial to Roman sensibilities. They wanted to witness the punishment while maintaining the fiction that they were not directly causing her death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, accompanied by the College of Pontifices, various magistrates, and often a significant portion of the population. The atmosphere was one of solemn terror rather than celebration. Citizens would line the route, many weeping, others standing in shocked silence. Children were often brought to witness this spectacle as a moral lesson, though many would be traumatized by what they saw. Upon reaching the execution site, the final preparations would begin. The underground chamber had been provisioned with a small bed, a lamp, and, in what the Romans considered an act of mercy, a jug of water, a small amount of bread, some milk, and a little oil. These provisions were not intended to sustain life, but rather to maintain the legal fiction that the Vestal was not being directly killed by human hands. The condemned woman would be lowered into the chamber by rope or ladder, often while still conscious and pleading for mercy. Historical accounts describe the terror in their voices as they called out to their fellow Vestals, to their families, and to the gods they had served faithfully for decades. Some maintained their innocence until the final moment, while others had been broken by the investigation process and accepted their fate in silence. Once the Vestal was inside the chamber, the entrance would be sealed. Heavy stones were placed over the opening, followed by earth, creating an impenetrable barrier between the condemned and the world above. The sealing process was methodical and thorough, ensuring that no sound could escape and no rescue would be possible. The crowd would hear the muffled sounds from below gradually fade into silence. The psychological horror of this death cannot be overstated. Unlike other forms of execution that were relatively quick, live burial condemned the victim to hours or even days of terror, isolation, and slowly mounting desperation. The victim would experience the full knowledge of their impending death while being powerless to prevent it, trapped in absolute darkness with only their thoughts and fears for company. Throughout Roman history, numerous Vestal virgins faced accusations of breaking their sacred vows, with each case revealing the complex interplay of religion, politics, and social control that characterized Roman society. These cases, documented by historians like Livy, Tacitus, and Pliny, provide us with detailed accounts of how accusations arose, how investigations proceeded, and how politics influenced outcomes. One of the earliest recorded cases occurred in 483 BCE, when a Vestal named Oppia was accused and executed for unchastity. According to Livy, her death was followed by a series of military defeats, which the Romans interpreted not as proof of divine displeasure with the execution, but as confirmation that her guilt had indeed angered the gods. This interpretation shows how the Romans rationalized these punishments, using subsequent events to justify their actions regardless of the outcome. The case of Postumia in 420 BCE illustrates how subjective and dangerous the accusation process could be. Postumia was charged not for any specific act of sexual misconduct, but for her manner of dress and behavior, which was deemed too worldly and flirtatious for a sacred virgin. She had begun wearing elaborate hairstyles and expensive jewelry and was observed speaking playfully with young men at public events. Although she was ultimately acquitted after a stern warning, her case demonstrates how narrow the acceptable boundaries were for these women. In 337 BCE, the Vestal Minutia faced accusations that arose from political rivalries within Rome's elite families. Her accuser was a slave who claimed to have witnessed her in compromising situations with a young patrician. The investigation revealed that the slave had been coached by political enemies of Minucia's family, who sought to damage their reputation and political standing. Despite evidence of the conspiracy, Minucia was still subjected to the trial process, highlighting how these sacred women could become pawns in political games. The reign of Domitian, 81 to 96 CE, saw a particularly brutal period for the Vestal virgins. The emperor, known for his paranoia and cruelty, used accusations against the Vestals as a way to demonstrate his piety and deflect attention from his own moral failings. He ordered the execution of the chief Vestal, Cornelia, on charges that many contemporaries believed were fabricated. The case against Cornelia was so weak that even the College of Pontifices expressed doubts, but Domitian's will prevailed. Cornelia's execution was particularly horrific because she maintained her innocence throughout the process. According to Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the event, she was dragged to the execution site while crying out that Caesar could not believe her unchaste when his victories proved that she had performed the sacred rites correctly. Her words fell on deaf ears, and she was buried alive while protesting her innocence to the end. The case of the Vestal Claudia in 143 CE demonstrates how family connections could both protect and endanger these sacred women. Claudia came from a powerful patrician family with connections throughout the Roman elite. When accusations arose against her, various influential figures intervened on her behalf, providing alibis and character witnesses. However, this very intervention was used by her accusers as evidence of a conspiracy to protect a guilty woman. Perhaps most tragic was the case of Julia Aquilia Severa, who served as a Vestal during the reign of Elagabalus, 218 to 222 CE. The emperor, notorious for his religious innovations and personal excesses, actually forced her to marry him, claiming that their union would produce divine children. When Elagabalus was assassinated and his successor came to power, Julia Aquilia was accused of having violated her vows through this forced marriage. Despite having been compelled into the relationship against her will, she faced the full penalty of the law. These individual cases reveal patterns that extended throughout Roman history. Accusations often coincided with periods of political instability, military defeat, or natural disaster. The women who faced these charges were frequently from prominent families whose political enemies could benefit from their disgrace. The investigations themselves were conducted in an atmosphere of presumed guilt, with the burden of proof effectively reversed. The intersection of politics and religious authority in ancient Rome created a system ripe for manipulation, with the Vestal virgins often serving as convenient targets for political machinations. The sacred nature of their office, which was supposed to protect them, actually made them more vulnerable to those who understood how to weaponize religious sentiment for political gain. Senators and other political figures quickly learned that accusations against Vestals could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Such charges could deflect blame for military defeats or natural disasters away from incompetent leadership and onto divine displeasure. They could eliminate political rivals by targeting their female relatives who served as Vestals. They could also demonstrate a leader's piety and moral authority by showing their willingness to punish even the most sacred figures when they transgressed. The process of making accusations was deliberately structured to favor political manipulation. Any Roman citizen could bring charges against a Vestal, but the investigation and trial were conducted by the College of Pontifices, a body that was inherently political. Members of this college were appointed through political processes and maintained their positions through political relationships. This meant that the same men who might benefit from a Vestal's downfall were responsible for judging her guilt or innocence. Evidence in these cases was often fabricated or manipulated to serve political ends. Slaves could be tortured to produce testimony against their master's enemies. Letters could be forged, witnesses coached, and circumstances arranged to create the appearance of guilt. The secretive nature of the investigations made it difficult for the accused to mount an effective defense, as she often had no knowledge of the specific charges or evidence against her until the trial was nearly concluded. The reign of Tiberius, 14 to 37 CE, provides several examples of how these accusations could be used for political purposes. When the emperor faced criticism for his military failures in Germania, accusations suddenly arose against multiple Vestals simultaneously. Historians noted the suspicious timing of these charges, which conveniently provided a religious explanation for Rome's military troubles, while allowing Tiberius to demonstrate his moral authority through harsh punishment of the allegedly guilty priestesses. Family rivalries within Rome's aristocratic class often played out through accusations against Vestal relatives. The case of Licinia in 113 BCE illustrates this pattern clearly. Licinia came from the powerful Licinia family, which had accumulated significant wealth and political influence through successful military campaigns and strategic marriages. When political enemies sought to weaken the family's position, they targeted Licinia with accusations of unchastity. The evidence against Licinia was circumstantial and largely based on her alleged relationship with a young equestrian named Crassus. However, investigation revealed that the accusations had been orchestrated by rival families who hoped to seize Licinian properties and political positions if the family fell into disgrace. The case became a proxy war between aristocratic factions, with Licinia's life hanging in the balance of political maneuvering that had nothing to do with her actual conduct. Economic motivations also played a role in false accusations. When Vestals died or were executed, their property reverted to the state or could be claimed by accusers under certain circumstances. This created financial incentives for bringing charges, particularly against wealthy priestesses from prominent families. The Vestal Aemilia, executed in 114 BCE, possessed extensive properties in prime Roman real estate that were subsequently distributed among her accusers and their political allies. The Emperor Caracalla, 198–217 CE, used accusations against Vestals as a tool of terror to maintain control over potential rivals. His reign was marked by paranoia and violence, and he discovered that threats against sacred figures were particularly effective in intimidating his opposition. Even the mere suggestion that a senator's daughter or relative serving as a Vestal might face investigation was often sufficient to ensure political compliance. The system of punishment surrounding the Vestal virgins functioned as more than just religious enforcement. It served as a sophisticated mechanism of social control that extended far beyond the priestesses themselves. The psychological impact of these executions rippled through Roman society, creating an atmosphere of fear and compliance that reinforced existing power structures and social hierarchies. The public nature of these trials and executions was carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact. Romans were required to witness not just the condemnation of the accused, but the entire process from investigation through burial. This forced participation created a collective trauma that bonded the community in shared guilt and fear. Citizens who watched these proceedings knew that if even the most sacred figures in society could face such horrible punishment, no one was truly safe from accusation and condemnation. The effect on other Vestal virgins was particularly devastating. These women lived in constant awareness that their sisters had been buried alive for alleged transgressions, knowing that they themselves might face the same fate at any moment. This created a culture of extreme self-surveillance and mutual monitoring within the Vestal house. Friendships became dangerous. Normal human emotions were suppressed, and every action was filtered through the lens of potential accusation. Roman families with daughters serving as Vestals experienced a unique form of ongoing terror. While they enjoyed the prestige and political advantages that came with having a family member among the priestesses, they also lived with the knowledge that their daughter's alleged misconduct could bring disgrace and persecution upon the entire family. This created powerful incentives for families to monitor and control their Vestal daughters, effectively turning loved ones into instruments of surveillance. The broader Roman population learned to associate female sexuality and independence with existential threat to the state. The message conveyed by these executions was clear. Women who stepped outside prescribed roles endangered not just themselves, but the entire community. This reinforced traditional gender hierarchies and made it extremely dangerous for any woman to challenge conventional expectations of female behavior. The psychological conditioning extended to Roman attitudes toward authority and dissent. If the gods themselves could be so cruel to their most devoted servants, what hope did ordinary citizens have of challenging earthly authorities? The Vestal executions demonstrated that even the most privileged and protected individuals in society were ultimately powerless against accusation and condemnation. This created a culture of submission and compliance that extended far beyond religious matters. Children who witnessed these spectacles or heard detailed accounts of them carried psychological scars throughout their lives. Roman education deliberately included exposure to these stories as moral instruction, but the trauma of learning about such cruelty often produced adults who were either paralyzed by fear or capable of extraordinary violence themselves. The normalization of such extreme punishment shaped Roman character in ways that historians are still attempting to understand. The knowledge that accusations could be fabricated for political purposes created a climate of paranoia and mistrust throughout Roman society. If Vestal virgins, supposedly protected by divine favor and legal immunity, could be falsely accused and executed, then anyone could be destroyed through false charges. This understanding made Romans extremely cautious about making enemies or challenging powerful figures, as the consequences could extend far beyond mere political or economic disadvantage. Religious belief itself became a source of psychological terror rather than comfort. Romans learned to fear their gods rather than love them, understanding that divine protection was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning. The capricious nature of these punishments taught that piety and virtue offered no guarantee of safety, creating a spiritual environment characterized by anxiety rather than devotion. The historical record of Vestal virgin executions comes to us through a variety of ancient sources, each providing different perspectives on these horrific events. These accounts, written by historians, philosophers, and eyewitnesses, offer us detailed glimpses into the procedures, justifications, and social reactions that surrounded these punishments. However, they also reflect the biases and limitations of their authors, requiring careful analysis to separate fact from interpretation. Livy's Ab Urbe Condita provides some of the earliest detailed accounts of Vestal executions, including the cases that occurred during the Roman Republic. His descriptions emphasize the religious necessity of these punishments, while also noting the political circumstances that surrounded many accusations. Livy's account of the trial of Oppia in 483 BCE includes details about the investigation process and the public reaction to her execution, showing how these events were understood by Romans as necessary sacrifices to maintain divine favor. Tacitus, writing during the early imperial period, provides a more critical perspective on these executions. His Annals includes accounts of Vestal trials during the reigns of various emperors, often highlighting the political motivations behind accusations. Tacitus was particularly critical of Domitian's persecution of the Vestals, noting how the emperor used these cases to enhance his own reputation for piety while deflecting attention from his moral failings. Pliny the Younger's letters offer perhaps the most personal and emotionally compelling accounts of these executions. As an eyewitness to several cases during Domitian's reign, Pliny provides detailed descriptions of the procedures and the reactions of both the condemned and the spectators. His account of Cornelia's execution is particularly harrowing, including her final words and the reaction of the crowd to her protests of innocence. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century CE, provides additional details about the legal procedures surrounding these cases. His accounts include information about how evidence was gathered, how trials were conducted, and how sentences were carried out. Dio also notes the political climate that surrounded many of these accusations, providing context for understanding why certain periods saw increased persecution of the Vestals. Plutarch's biographical works include several references to Vestal executions, particularly in his lives of prominent Roman figures who were involved in these cases, either as accusers or as political figures who benefited from the outcomes. His accounts often focus on the moral and political implications of these events, providing insight into how contemporaries understood and justified these extreme punishments. Archaeological evidence has also contributed to our understanding of these executions. Excavations near the Porta Collina have uncovered remains of underground chambers that may have been used for live burials, though the identification of these sites remains controversial among scholars. The physical evidence, while limited, provides some confirmation of the literary accounts and helps us understand the practical aspects of these executions. Legal documents and inscriptions provide additional context for understanding these cases. Roman legal texts explain the procedures for investigating and trying Vestals, while inscriptions commemorate both executed and vindicated priestesses. These sources help us understand how Roman law attempted to balance the sacred status of the Vestals with the perceived need to punish their transgressions. Christian writers of the later imperial period, such as Augustine and Jerome, also commented on these executions, though their accounts are colored by their opposition to traditional Roman religion. These writers often used accounts of Vestal executions to criticize pagan practices and demonstrate the superiority of Christian morality, but their works preserve some details about these events that might otherwise have been lost. The practice of executing Vestal virgins through live burial had profound and lasting effects on Roman society, religion, and culture that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the events themselves. These executions became embedded in the Roman consciousness as both necessary religious observance and terrifying demonstration of divine and state power, shaping attitudes toward religion, authority, and gender roles for centuries. The immediate religious impact was to reinforce the Romans' understanding of their relationship with the divine as fundamentally transactional and precarious. The god's protection of Rome was conditional upon precise observance of ritual obligations, and the slightest deviation could result in catastrophic consequences. This understanding fostered a religious culture characterized by anxiety and scrupulous attention to ceremonial detail rather than personal spiritual development or emotional connection to the divine. The executions also served to strengthen the authority of the Pontifical College and, by extension, the Roman state itself. By demonstrating their willingness to execute even the most sacred figures when they transgressed, Roman authorities showed that no one was above the law or beyond the reach of state power. This reinforced hierarchical social structures and discouraged challenges to established authority at every level of society. The gender implications of these executions were particularly significant and long-lasting. The message that female sexuality posed an existential threat to the state became deeply embedded in Roman culture, influencing laws, social customs, and attitudes toward women for generations. The extreme punishment of Vestals, who allegedly broke their vows of chastity, served as a warning to all women about the consequences of stepping outside prescribed gender roles. The psychological impact on Roman families was enormous, particularly those from the aristocratic classes who provided daughters to serve as Vestals. The knowledge that their daughters could face such horrible punishment created powerful incentives for families to monitor and control their female members, reinforcing patriarchal authority within the household, while creating ongoing anxiety about the behavior and reputation of family members. The executions influenced Roman literature and artistic expression in complex ways. While poets and writers generally avoided direct criticism of these practices, they often explored themes of innocence betrayed, divine cruelty, and the powerlessness of individuals against state authority. The figure of the condemned Vestal became a symbol of tragic victimhood that appeared in various forms throughout Roman literature. Legal and judicial practices were also affected by the precedents set in Vestal trials. The procedures developed for investigating and trying these cases, including the use of secret testimony, the acceptance of circumstantial evidence, and the reversal of the burden of proof, were later applied to other types of crimes. This contributed to the development of judicial systems that favored the state and made it increasingly difficult for accused individuals to defend themselves effectively. The economic impact of these executions was significant, but often overlooked by ancient commentators. When Vestals were executed, their substantial properties reverted to the state or were distributed among their accusers, creating financial incentives for bringing charges. This commercialization of religious persecution had lasting effects on Roman attitudes toward wealth, property rights, and the relationship between economic and political power. The practice also influenced Roman attitudes toward death and punishment more generally. The elaborate cruelty of live burial, justified by religious necessity, helped normalize extreme forms of punishment throughout Roman society. This contributed to the development of increasingly brutal forms of entertainment and legal sanctions that characterized later periods of Roman history. The practice of executing Vestal virgins through live burial did not end abruptly, but rather declined gradually over several centuries as Roman religion, politics, and social attitudes evolved. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire, the rise of Christianity, and changing concepts of justice and religious observance all contributed to the eventual abandonment of this horrific punishment. During the later imperial period, beginning roughly in the 2nd century CE, accusations against Vestals became increasingly rare. This decline reflected several factors, including the growing influence of Stoic philosophy, which emphasized mercy and rational justice, and the increasing skepticism among educated Romans about traditional religious practices. Emperors, who were more concerned with practical governance than religious theater, found these dramatic executions less useful as tools of political control. The rise of Christianity played a crucial role in ending these executions, though the process was gradual and complex. Christian writers like Augustine and Tertullian condemned the practice as barbaric and contrary to divine mercy, but their influence was limited until Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Even then, the transformation was not immediate, as Christian emperors had to balance their new religious convictions against traditional Roman expectations and practices. The Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century marked a turning point, though he did not immediately abolish the institution of the Vestal virgins or formally prohibit their execution. Instead, his reign saw a gradual reduction in the political and religious importance of the Vestals as Christian institutions and practices gained prominence. The eternal flame of Vesta began to compete with the eternal light of Christ for symbolic significance in Roman religious consciousness. The practical difficulties of maintaining the Vestal institution also contributed to the decline of these executions. As Roman society became increasingly diverse and cosmopolitan, finding suitable candidates from traditional Roman families became more challenging. The prestige associated with Vestal service declined as alternative forms of religious and social prominence became available through Christian institutions. Legal reforms during the later empire also made these executions more difficult to justify and implement. The influence of Christian concepts of mercy and redemption, combined with evolving Roman legal principles that emphasized proportionality in punishment, created an intellectual climate that was increasingly hostile to such extreme sanctions. Legal scholars began to question whether live burial could be reconciled with emerging principles of justice and human dignity. The last recorded execution of a Vestal virgin occurred during the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century CE, though some scholars argue that isolated cases may have occurred as late as the 4th century. By this time, however, such executions had become exceptional rather than routine responses to accusations of unchastity, and they were increasingly criticized by both pagan and Christian commentators. The formal end of the Vestal institution came in 394 CE, when Emperor Theodosius I ordered the extinguishing of the sacred fire and the dissolution of the College of Vestals as part of his broader campaign to eliminate pagan religious practices. This marked the definitive end of a tradition that had lasted for over 1,000 years and had claimed the lives of dozens of women through one of history's most cruel forms of execution. The transformation was not merely administrative, but reflected a fundamental shift in Roman religious and moral consciousness. The Christian emphasis on divine mercy and forgiveness stood in stark contrast to the harsh transactional relationship with the gods that had characterized traditional Roman religion. The idea that human sacrifice or extreme punishment could ensure divine favor became increasingly unacceptable to a society that was learning to see all humans as possessing inherent dignity as children of God. The horrific punishment of Vestal virgins through live burial remains one of the most chilling examples of institutionalized cruelty in human history, continuing to shock and disturb scholars, students, and general readers more than 15 centuries after the last such execution occurred. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond their immediate historical context, providing insights into the nature of power, the manipulation of religious belief, and the vulnerability of women in patriarchal societies. Modern historians and anthropologists have analyzed these executions as examples of what scholars term sacred violence, cruelty that is justified and legitimized through religious belief and ritual practice. The Vestal executions demonstrate how societies can transform the most extreme forms of brutality into moral necessities, creating systems where ordinary people not only tolerate but actively participate in atrocities they might otherwise find abhorrent. The psychological mechanisms that enabled these executions continue to be studied by researchers interested in understanding how societies normalize violence against vulnerable populations. The process by which Roman citizens convinced themselves that burying women alive was not only acceptable but religiously required provides disturbing parallels to other historical instances of sanctioned cruelty, from witch trials to modern genocides. Feminist scholars have particularly focused on these cases as examples of how patriarchal societies use extreme punishment of women to maintain gender hierarchies and control female sexuality. The Vestal executions represent perhaps the most extreme form of what modern analysts call honor-based violence, where women's bodies become battlegrounds for larger social and political conflicts in which they have no voice or agency. Legal historians have examined the procedures used in Vestal trials as precursors to later forms of political persecution and show trials. The reversal of the burden of proof, the acceptance of circumstantial evidence, the use of secret testimony, and the presumption of guilt that characterize these cases would later appear in various forms throughout history whenever authorities sought to eliminate inconvenient individuals while maintaining the facade of legal process. The archaeological investigation of possible execution sites has provided additional insights into the practical aspects of these punishments while raising disturbing questions about how many women may have suffered this fate. Excavations near Rome have uncovered underground chambers that may have been used for live burials, though the identification of these sites remains controversial, and their examination continues to yield new information about these horrific events. Contemporary discussions of religious freedom and the separation of church and state often reference the Vestal executions as examples of the dangers inherent in combining religious and political authority. The cases demonstrate how religious institutions can be corrupted when they become tools of political control, leading to outcomes that serve neither genuine spiritual needs nor legitimate governmental purposes. The psychological trauma experienced by the victims of these executions has been analyzed by modern experts in trauma and abuse, who note that live burial represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating form of execution possible. The combination of prolonged terror, complete helplessness, and awareness of approaching death created levels of suffering that challenge our understanding of human endurance and resilience. Modern discussions of criminal justice and punishment reform often cite the Vestal executions as examples of how societies can convince themselves that extreme cruelty serves legitimate purposes.